The unexpected war. The sky over Earth turned red the day the ships came. No one had time to fight. The war started and ended in less than 3 days. They were faster, stronger, smarter. The alien fleet didn't come to talk. They came to take, and humans lost everything. The aliens called themselves the Zherani. Tall, cold, beautiful, and proud. They didn't kill many. Instead, they captured. They didn't want to destroy Earth. They wanted to own it, to rule it, and to use the people. Jace had been a mechanic, just a regular guy. He lived in a small town, worked long hours, and had a soft heart. When the Zherani came, he didn't run. He stayed to help others. That's how they caught him. One moment, he was pulling a child from rubble. The next, he was surrounded by glowing armor, paralyzed, and dragged into a ship. He didn't even get to say goodbye to his family. Inside the alien ship, humans were sorted, labeled, scanned. Some were sent to factories, others to distant colonies. Jace was different. He was taken to a black room, where 3 Zherani officers looked at him like he was some rare pet. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward. She had silver blue skin and eyes that glowed like stars. Her voice was soft, but there was no kindness in it. "This one is mine," she said. "He will serve me personally." Jace didn't understand her words, but the tone made it clear. He had just been claimed. Her name was Velhara, a mistress, a daughter of the Zherani High Council. She was powerful, feared, and cold as ice. She didn't believe humans were anything more than tools, pretty little things to keep and play with. She had no idea Jace would change her life. He was taken to her private ship. His clothes were replaced with a simple gray robe. His hands were bound. But even through fear, Jace stayed calm. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He watched. He listened. And that somehow made Velhara curious. Most humans broke down. They sobbed. They screamed. But not this one. "You are brave," she said, walking around him like a hunter. Or perhaps too stupid to fear. Jace didn't answer. He just looked at her, his eyes full of quiet fire. That night, Velhara tested him. She ordered him to kneel, to clean her boots, to serve her food, to stay silent unless spoken to. He did everything, but not like a beaten man. He moved with purpose, dignity. And Velhara noticed. "What makes you so calm, Earthling?" she asked the next day. He shrugged. "You've taken my world. I can't stop that, but you won't take my mind." It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was truth. Simple and honest. Velhara didn't reply. Days passed. Jace kept doing his tasks. He fixed broken machines on her ship. He kept her chambers in order. He learned their language fast, surprising everyone. The other Zherani servants whispered about him. Some mocked him. Others feared him. Velhara just watched. One night, she asked him to sit instead of kneel. That night, something shifted. "You humans are strange," she said. "You fall, you lose, but you still hope." Jace looked at her. "Hope is all we have. It's what makes us human." For a moment, Velhara said nothing. Then she got up and left. But her steps were slower. Her thoughts, louder. Something was changing inside her, and she didn't know why. And deep in space, on a stolen world, a human heart had started to do what no weapon could. It was breaking down the walls of a mistress who thought she owned everything. The cold command. Velhara stood before the great window of her ship, watching the stars slide past. They always brought her peace, until now. Her thoughts were not on galaxies or victory. They were on him, Jace, the earthling slave who refused to act like one. She had ordered him to clean her blade that morning, a command meant to show dominance. But instead of trembling, he'd looked at her calmly and said, "Yes, mistress," like a soldier following orders, not a man broken in spirit. He did not flinch. He did not beg. He understood her orders but didn't let them crush him. And that annoyed her. Velhara had broken stronger men. Zherani males feared her temper. She once made a captain cry with just a glance. But this human, with his soft skin and stubborn heart, was like ice, unmelting, unmoved. She ordered him into her chambers again. When he entered, he didn't look down like most slaves. He made eye contact. Not in challenge, in acknowledgement. It was maddening. "I do not understand you," Velhara said, circling him like a cold wind. "You obey, but you do not yield." Jace didn't respond at first. Then, "There's a difference between obedience and surrender." She tilted her head. "You believe you have a choice." He nodded. "I always have a choice, even if it's only how I carry myself." Velhara studied him, her face blank. Inside, her mind raced. He spoke with no fear, but also no arrogance. There was something pure in his tone, something unfamiliar. She gave a sharp command. "On your knees." He dropped instantly, but his gaze remained steady, not defiant, aware. His silence said, "I choose this, not because I'm weak, but because I choose peace." It made her stomach twist. She turned away, disturbed by her own reaction. In the halls, the crew whispered. The human was being kept in the Mistress's wing. He was not punished. He was not broken. Some said he had magic. Others said he had a death wish. Only Velhara knew the truth. He was changing her. That night, she tested him again. This time, not with work, but with words. "Your species is weak," she said as he poured her drink. "You lost your war in 3 days." Jace nodded. "Yes, but we never stopped hoping." "Hope does nothing," she snapped. He smiled. "Then why are you thinking about it?" Velhara went quiet. That night, she couldn't sleep. Jace's words echoed in her mind like a song she didn't want to hear but couldn't stop humming. The next day, something strange happened. One of the ship's engineers, a proud Zherani female named Kellen, dropped a power core. It cracked. Sparks flew. A normal slave would panic or run. Jace jumped in, hands bare, and yanked the sparking unit free before it could explode. He tossed it into a containment pod and took the burn without complaint. Kellen stared. "Why would you risk your life?" He shrugged, shaking the pain off. "Because people would have died." She sneered, confused. "But you're a slave." Jace just smiled. "That doesn't change what's right." Velhara saw the incident from her chamber feed. She replayed the footage 10 times. What kind of creature saves his enemies with a smile? That evening, she walked into his small quarters without a word. He stood quickly, ready to serve. Instead of giving orders, she sat on the edge of the room and stared at him. "You feel pain, don't you?" she asked. "Of course. But you don't show it." "I do, just not the way you expect." That answer sat in her chest like a stone. "Why didn't you run when we invaded your world?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her with a quiet sadness. "Because I had people to protect. That's what we do, even when we lose." Velhara's throat felt tight. She got up without speaking and left the room. As the door slid shut behind her, she placed a hand over her chest. Why did it feel like something inside her was cracking? She was the mistress. She gave commands. She was the cold blade of Zherani justice. But that human, he obeyed her, but he was changing the very air around her, and she didn't know how to stop it. The spark of defiance. Jace walked the metal corridors of Velhara's ship like a ghost, always present, yet not truly seen. At first, the crew mocked him. Now, they watched in silence. The human was strange, too calm, too focused. He didn't flinch when shouted at. He didn't speak unless asked. But when he worked, fixing power cells, adjusting flight stabilizers, cleaning broken conduits, he did it with a care that confused the Zherani. Slaves weren't supposed to care. Velhara watched too. She didn't call him into her chamber that night, but she stood behind a hidden screen, listening as he hummed softly while working. A human song. No translator could understand it, but something in that sound made her feel unsettled. She left quickly, as if the melody might break her. The next day, a commotion stirred near the ship's hangar. A junior Zherani guard had struck a lower slave, a human woman, for dropping tools. It was routine, normal. No one questioned it. Until Jace stepped in. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He simply walked between them, standing still. The guard sneered. "Move, slave." Jace said nothing. The guard raised his arm. Jace didn't flinch. The strike never landed. Velhara's voice sliced through the air like a blade. Enough. Every head turned. The guard froze. No one had noticed her arrival. Her eyes locked on Jace. "You will not be punished," she said flatly. Then, turning to the guard, "But you will be." The crew gasped. Zherani punished Zherani for a slave. Velhara said nothing more. She walked away, her cloak trailing behind her. But her mind was chaos. Why had she done that? Why did she feel ashamed watching the woman cry? She never used to feel anything. Later that night, she called Jace into her quarters. No orders, no demands. She simply pointed to a chair across from her. He sat. "Why did you step in?" she asked. "She was hurt," he said. "That's enough reason. You could have been killed. I've already lost everything. What's left is mine to choose." Velhara stared at him. "You keep saying that. Choice. But you have none." Jace smiled gently. "You think I don't. But look at me. I choose how I act. I choose to help. I choose not to hate you." She flinched. Not because of anger. Because the words moved her. She stood, pacing. "You confuse me." "Good," he said softly. She turned sharply. "Don't be clever." "I'm not. I'm just being honest." Velhara's breath caught. There was no fear in his voice, no manipulation, just truth. A dangerous kind of truth. She sat down again, slower this time. "My people. They were taught that humans are wild, violent, emotional. We are," Jace said. "But we also love. We build. We grow. We forgive." Velhara looked at her own hands. Cold, strong, empty. Something inside her cracked again. The next day, something unthinkable happened. A Zherani servant offered to help Jace with his task. No words were spoken, just a quiet hand passing him a tool. That simple act spread like wildfire. A whisper among the ship, "The human is changing something." Velhara noticed, but she wasn't angry. She was afraid, because deep down she knew, if this kept going, she would change too. And she didn't know what she'd become. That night, she didn't summon Jace, but she watched him through the surveillance feed. He was sitting in his room, alone, carving a small shape from scrap metal. A bird, wings spread, a symbol of freedom. Velhara touched the screen. Why did she feel like he was the one in control? Why did her chest ache when he smiled at something simple? The spark had lit, and it was spreading. Through metal walls, alien hearts, and a mistress who thought she could never be touched. The chains began to break. A cold silence filled the Zherani high ship. Velhara stood before a panel of 3 commanders, elders of her people, old and sharp as steel. "You've gone soft," Commander Vurik said, his eyes narrow. "Your crew is questioning discipline. Your slave, this human, is becoming a symbol." Velhara didn't blink. "The ship runs better than ever." And yet, Commander Lyra added, "There is talk. You allow the human to walk freely. You defend him. Some say you even listen to him." Velhara's jaw tightened. "I command respect." "Then prove it," Vurik snapped. "Remove the human. Publicly. Show your loyalty." She didn't respond. They took her silence as fear, but it wasn't fear. It was conflict. That night, she returned to her ship with a storm in her chest. She didn't go to her chamber. She went straight to Jace's small quarters. He was sitting cross-legged, fixing a broken fan. "You shouldn't be fixing things," she said. "You're not crew." "I go where I'm needed," Jace replied without looking up. She stared at him, her voice flat. "The commanders want me to punish you, to make an example." He paused. "Will you?" "I should," she whispered, "to protect myself." Jace stood slowly, setting the tool down. "Then do it." Velhara blinked. "You're not afraid." "I'm tired of living afraid." The room went quiet. Velhara stepped closer. "Do you hate me?" "No," Jace said calmly. "But I think you're trapped, just like the rest of us." She frowned. "I am not a prisoner." Jace tilted his head. "Aren't you? You follow rules you don't believe in. You protect lies. You serve fear." The words cut deeper than any blade. Velhara turned away. She didn't sleep that night. In the command chamber, the crew was unusually quiet. The guards avoided Jace's eyes. Some even nodded at him. Respect. It had started to spread. Velhara noticed. She also noticed the way her own orders now carried doubt. Not from others, but from herself. She called a private meeting with her first officer, Zherani. "You've worked with me for years," she said. "Speak honestly. What do you think of the human?" Zherani hesitated. Then, "He's dangerous." Velhara's eyes narrowed. "Not because he fights," Zherani continued, "but because he changes people. Without force. Without threats. Just by being who he is. That's power we don't understand." Velhara looked away. Maybe Zherani was right. Maybe that was why she couldn't stop thinking about him. Later, in the training chamber, she found Jace practicing with a wooden staff. Alone, moving slowly like a dancer in meditation. "Where did you learn that?" she asked. Jace looked up, sweat on his brow. "From a friend back home. He said when the mind is loud, let the body be quiet." She stepped into the ring. "Show me." He blinked. "You want to spar?" "Afraid," she teased. He gave a half smile. "Always. But I don't let it stop me." Their first exchange was slow. Velhara struck. He dodged. He moved differently than her kind. More grounded, more unpredictable. Their staffs clacked. Sparks flew. But something else sparked too. Connection. Not of war, but of understanding. She stopped mid-motion, lowering her weapon. "You make everything complicated." Jace stepped back. "You make everything simple. Hurt or obey. Win or lose. But life isn't like that." Velhara looked at him. "What is life then?" Jace gave a quiet smile. "It's what happens when you stop trying to own everything." Those words echoed inside her long after he left. The next day, Velhara received another message from the commanders. "Remove the human or be removed from command." She stared at the screen. Something inside her broke. She sent no reply. Instead, she walked to the center of the ship and made a public announcement. "Jace of Earth is no longer a slave. He is free. He stays as my guest, and any hand raised against him will answer to me." Gasps, shock, chaos. The chains had snapped. Velhara had crossed a line. And Jace was no longer just a symbol. He was hope. Whispers of rebellion. The news spread like a virus, faster than any weapon. A human slave had been freed. Not escaped. Not rescued. Freed. By a Zherani mistress. Velhara's name lit up every secure comm channel in the fleet. Some called her broken. Others said she'd gone mad. A few whispered a more dangerous word. Traitor. On the main bridge of her ship, the atmosphere had changed. The officers moved more carefully. The guards looked at each other with uncertain eyes. A single decision had turned structure into chaos. Velhara sat in her command chair, quiet but firm. She had not changed her mind. And deep inside, she knew she never would. Meanwhile, Jace walked through the ship without chains for the first time. His hands were free. His back was straight. Some Zherani still sneered, but others stepped aside. A few nodded. The humans in the lower quarters watched him with wide eyes. They had no words. He had done what none of them had even dreamed. He had been freed and protected. That night, a young human girl named Rila approached him, her voice trembling. "Is it true?" she asked. "You're not a slave anymore." Jace smiled gently. "I guess not. How did you do it?" He knelt to her eye level. "I didn't fight. I just kept being myself." She didn't understand the full meaning, but she nodded. Hope is like that. It doesn't need explanations. It just needs to exist. Elsewhere, unrest began to rise. On nearby ships, other humans tried to speak up. Some Zherani officers silenced them with harsh punishments, but not all. One mistress refused to beat her slave. Another let her human crew eat in peace instead of on the floor. Small changes, but real. Velhara received a message from her old friend, Commander Tereth. Once, they had trained together. Now his voice held warning. "You've started something you can't control," he said. "I don't want control," Velhara answered. "I want truth. There is no truth in weakness. Then maybe your strength is a lie." He ended the call. Velhara stood in silence, her hands trembling for the first time in years. Later, she found Jace on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. "You don't belong in chains," she said softly. He turned. "No one does." "I thought I understood what order meant," she admitted. "But maybe I was just following shadows." Jace didn't interrupt. He just listened. It was what made him different. He didn't force change. He made space for it. She stepped closer. "You've changed me." He met her gaze. "No, you just finally stopped hiding who you really are." Her heart beat too loud in her chest. She hated it. And yet, it felt right. For the first time, Velhara didn't feel powerful. She felt seen. That night, alarms blared. A Zherani patrol ship docked without request. Aboard it, High Inquisitor Draven, a cold, ancient judge of the Zherani Code. Dressed in crimson armor, his eyes were fire. "You have committed violation against the throne," he told Velhara at once. "Freeing a slave is an act of treason." Velhara stood tall. "He is not a slave. He is a man." The entire bridge went still. Draven stepped forward. "You will hand him over now, or face removal of command." "I won't," she said simply. Draven sneered. "Then you've chosen exile." "So be it." Jace stepped forward. "This is my fault. Don't lose everything because of me." Velhara looked at him. "No, this is everything." She turned to her crew. "Anyone who follows me does so by choice. I no longer serve the throne. I serve what's right." A long silence followed. Then, one by one, officers removed their Zherani crest badges and laid them on the floor. They chose her. They chose change. And Draven, he left with a warning. "You'll burn for this." But the fire had already started. Not to destroy, to purify, to begin something new. And Jace, the once nameless slave, had become more than free. He had become the reason others now believed. Her heart, unchained. The war had started, or rather, it had begun again. Velhara's decision had sent ripples across the Zherani Empire. Her command was questioned at every corner. The High Inquisitors had been dispatched to her ship. There had been threats of death, exile, and worse. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the beating of her own heart, a sound she hadn't heard in years. She sat in her private chamber, staring at the stars outside the window. The hum of the ship's engines was the only thing that kept her company. Her door slid open. Jace entered without knocking, his usual calm demeanor unshaken. "You're quiet tonight," he said. Velhara didn't answer immediately. Her fingers were clenched at her sides. A part of her wanted to run from everything, from the rebellion, from the power, from the constant feeling of guilt and uncertainty. Another part of her wanted to grab him and never let go. "Are you okay?" Jace's voice brought her back to the moment. She stood, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not sure I've ever been okay." Jace took a slow step forward. "This isn't easy for you." "It wasn't supposed to be this way," she admitted. "I never planned for this. For you, for what you're making me feel." He stepped closer, his presence grounding her. "You're not weak for feeling, Velhara. You're human too." She flinched at the word. Human. He said it as if it was a blessing, a strength. But to her people, it was a curse. It was a reminder of everything they had conquered, everything they had destroyed. And now it was a word she couldn't escape. "Do you think this is love?" she asked quietly. "Is that what you're trying to show me? The human way?" Jace didn't speak for a moment. "No. I'm trying to show you that love can be anything you want it to be. Not just pain, not just control, but freedom, Velhara. You've spent your whole life chasing power, but you've never known what it means to be free." Her breath caught. It was true. She had always fought for power. But now, what was she fighting for? She had no answer. She walked away from him, her hands shaking. "I don't know how to be free. I don't know how to be with you and still keep everything else intact." "Velhara," his voice softened, "maybe you don't have to keep it all intact. Maybe it's okay to break." She turned, her eyes searching his. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to control everything. "I'm not perfect, Jace," she whispered. "I've been broken for so long. How can you love someone like me?" Jace walked toward her, slowly, like she was a fragile thing, something worth protecting. "You're not broken, Velhara. You're just lost. And that's okay. We can find our way together." For a moment, she let herself believe him. She let herself feel the warmth in his words, in the softness of his gaze. But then, the doors to her chamber slid open. Her heart stuttered. It was Commander Tereth, his face grim. "There's a fleet approaching," he said, his voice clipped. "The High Inquisitors. They've come for your head." Velhara stood tall, the weight of the situation crashing back into her chest. "It's too late to stop it." "No," Jace said, stepping forward. "It's never too late to stop it." Tereth looked between them, his eyes full of confusion. "You can't stand against them, Mistress. You've defied everything Zherani law holds sacred." Velhara's gaze hardened. "I've chosen a different path." Jace nodded. "And I'm standing with you." The words hit her like a wave. He wasn't leaving her side. No matter what happened, he would be there. The human who had once been her prisoner, her slave, was now standing beside her as an equal, an ally. But that didn't make the danger go away. It only made it real. The fleet was approaching. The Zherani were coming, and they were not merciful. Velhara turned to face Tereth. "Call the others. It's time to take a stand." Jace walked to her side, his hand brushing hers for a moment. The touch was a spark, a promise that for once, they were in this together. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "I'm with you. Always." Velhara's heart twisted in a way she couldn't explain. He had no reason to stand by her. He could have left, could have run, but he chose to stay. And that, more than anything, made her believe in what they were fighting for. Not for power, not for war, but for freedom. For the chance to live and love without chains. The final stand. The sound of Zherani warships filled the air, thundering through the void like a storm of destruction. The fleet had arrived, silent, cold, unyielding. Velhara stood at the helm of her ship, her heart pounding like a drum. She had made her choice. She had freed Jace. She had defied her people. But now the time for choice was over. It was time for action. Behind her, Jace stood, watching the stars as they sped past the viewport. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough. She didn't need words to know he was with her. He had been from the moment he stepped into her life. "They'll come for us, Velhara," Tereth said, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with concern. "You know this. They won't forgive what you've done." "I don't need their forgiveness," she replied, her voice steady, though inside, the weight of the decision was heavy. "I need their freedom." Jace turned to her, his face set in determination. "And we'll fight for it." Velhara nodded. For the first time, the words didn't feel like a promise to herself. They felt like the truth. "We'll fight for it." The comm system buzzed to life. Commander Draven's cold voice came through the speakers, sharp and venomous. "Velhara, you have been deemed a traitor. Surrender now, or we will destroy everything you have ever known. You will face the wrath of the Zherani Empire." Velhara didn't flinch. She didn't even hesitate. She walked to the communications panel and keyed in her response, her words cutting through the static. "We are not your slaves, Draven. We are not your toys to control. You have underestimated us for the last time." Silence. Then, the roar of engines. The Zherani fleet moved forward, their ships looming like dark monsters in the distance, closing in for the kill. "Brace for impact," Tereth called out. The crew scrambled, preparing for the inevitable. The final stand had begun. But Velhara wasn't afraid. Not anymore. She turned to Jace, meeting his eyes. "This is it," she said softly. "This is our moment." Jace smiled, his eyes soft, but filled with fire. "We've already won." As the first blast from the Zherani fleet rocked the ship, Velhara's hand found Jace's. She squeezed it, the connection grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. For so long, she had been the ruler, the one in control, the one who had never needed anyone. But now, she realized just how much strength there was in unity, how much strength there was in love. The warships fired again, and the ship trembled beneath them. Velhara's breath came in quick bursts, but she didn't move. She didn't run. She stood. "All hands to battle stations," she ordered, her voice firm. "We fight for freedom." The crew erupted into action, taking positions, manning weapons, preparing for what was to come. And Velhara. She made her way to the command deck, standing tall at the center, her gaze steady on the advancing fleet. "We won't run. We won't hide," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "We fight for something bigger than all of us." Jace moved beside her, his face resolute. "I'll never leave your side, Velhara. No matter what happens." Velhara looked at him, her heart swelling. She had never thought it possible to feel this way. Not for a slave, not for anyone. But here, in the face of destruction, she realized the truth. She needed him. Not as a prisoner, not as a servant, but as an equal, as a partner. And that realization was worth more than any victory. The first wave of fire hit the ship. The shields flickered, barely holding up. The Zherani fleet was relentless, firing, circling, closing in like wolves on a wounded animal. Velhara could hear the alarms blaring, feel the ship groan under the pressure. But she didn't flinch. "We've got this," Jace said, a fire in his voice now. "Hold steady." And then, the unthinkable happened. The other ships in the fleet, those once loyal to the Zherani Empire, began to split. One by one, they turned, aligning with Velhara's ship. The rebellion had spread farther than anyone had expected. Zherani officers, soldiers, even slaves, those who had seen the truth in Velhara's words, came to her side. The tide had turned. Draven's fleet slowed, confused, as they realized what was happening. "No," Draven's voice screamed through the comms. "You will regret this." But it was too late. Velhara gave the final order. Fire. Her ship's cannons roared, tearing through the remaining ships of the Zherani fleet. And with one last shot, the battle was over. The empire that had ruled for centuries lay in ruins. But in its place, something new was born, a new order, forged by the humans, by Velhara, by choice. As the dust settled, Velhara stood in the midst of the crew, her gaze sweeping over the people who had followed her. They had all risked everything for this, and now they were free. Jace stepped beside her, his hand resting on hers. "It's over." "No," she whispered, "it's just the beginning." Together, they looked out at the stars, not as conquerors, not as slaves, but as free people choosing their own future. And for the first time in her life, Velhara knew what it meant to be truly free.